تبسم تبسم وخل الهموم وخل الغموم وخل الضجر ولا تبتئس من صروف الزمان ولا تشتكي من طعون البشر.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jumma Mubarak to all of you and your loved ones. On behalf of the Imams, the Musallis and the officials of Masjid Abu Bakr Siddiq, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Advocate Yusuf Ismail to give you a little background on Advocate Yusuf Ismail. Those that don't know him, he is a lecturer at the University of South Africa and he lectures in law. He has, and he still is, debating leading international and well-known South African Christian academics. He is the IPCI's comparative religion specialist and public debater. He is also an independent researcher on religion and politics. And his topic that he's going to present this afternoon is entitled The Quranic View of Disunity and the Global Impact on the Muslim Ummah. Without further ado, Advocate Yusuf.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Sadaqallah al-azim. My dear respected elders, brothers, sisters in Islam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Presently in the world, we find, I want to firstly thank my chairman for the generous introduction, and it's always a privilege and a pleasure to be here in Pretoria engaging with this mosque. And for the first time, when we last came here in 2011 or 2013, some of the developments that I had not yet seen, I think this particular masjid is particularly unique in terms of it being a multi-utility center where people, youth, and the community in general can, of course, interact and engage in various activities. Coming to the issue at hand, we're living at a particular point in history where there's global turmoil, there's internal turmoil within our countries, as we have seen just in South Africa, from where I come from in Durban. A few weeks ago, you find hand-to-hand combat on the street, people being necklaced in the city of Durban, which you don't see, you've never seen it before, other than in the heights of apartheid. And of course, we see that we're living in a society where violence, killing, crime has become very much the order of the day, to the extent that the general community is, that the consensus seems to be that people are desensitized to what we see because of the level of violence, because of the level of hate, because of the level of discord. There seems to be a desensitization in our communities at large. And this also impacts in terms of how we view ourselves as a community, as an ummah, vis-a-vis in relation to other communities and other societies in the world and on a limited local level. When we have a very rudimentary understanding of our Islamic ethos, then we essentially dislocate what is contained in the Quran and remove it from the context in which we see ourselves. Because generally speaking, if you ask any Muslim about the solutions to our community, he will say, labelistically or in a sloganeering fashion, Islam has the answers. Islam has the solutions to our problem. But unfortunately, even though people have the sloganeering mentality of Islam has the solutions, we don't have any solutions being offered up in our communities or at a global scale in 52 countries of the world. And then generally, the retort to that is, well, we need to come back to the Quran and the Sunnah. We need to go back to the Akabirin or to the ulama. We need to go back to that. But the sloganeering divorces us from the main point, which is that as a whole, generally, Muslims do not have an interpretative relationship to the text of the Quran. So therefore, when someone or some individual wants to appropriate a Quranic verse or an ayah and then seeks to justify a particular action that he wants to engage in, then somehow or the other he seems to gain legitimacy in Muslim eyes, or, for example, in the eyes of the Islamophobes out there. And so it's important that when we view ourselves in relation to each other as a community and in relation to other communities out there, when we appropriate for ourselves the identity of being a Muslim in the 21st century, then it also means that we do not atomize verses of the Quran, divorce them totally out of its context, and fail to maintain a total interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran. I'll give you a classic example, and this maybe takes us a bit outside the terrain of what I was going to discuss today. But people today, for example, call for the imposition of the Sharia. We hear that. Although there is no book called Sharia law. We don't have a book which was written or can be accurately attributed to, for example, Imam Abu Hanifa, even though the Al-Hidayah, the book of Hanafi laws, which we basically have attributed to him, we don't have particular material which we can attribute to him, if you are a Hanafi, for example. When you look at the call for the imposition of the Sharia, this is where the period of dislocation occurs. When Muslim jurisprudence, which we would call fiqh, acquired its systematic juristic form during what we would call the Abbasid period, it incorporated the logic of Muslim imperialism at that particular time. Meaning that the fuqaha of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries utilize the Quran and the Sunnah as an absolute reference frame. That was the absolute reference frame. That is eternal. That is constant. It doesn't change. But in looking at the problems of their particular communities, they then evolved an interpretative framework, which is described as fiqh, to find the solutions to that particular problems at that particular juncture in history. And they used a fundamental principle or tool, which is called ijtihad. When Muslim countries talk about imposing the Sharia today, or calling, when ISIS, for example, talks about calling for the Sharia today, what are they really meaning? In many instances, you find that conservative Muslim countries are actually calling for the reimposition of that particular juristic interpretation, which evolved in a particular context, and then implemented in the 21st century, and therefore you find the dislocation happens. So the problem is that, this is just as an aside, that when we look at analyzing these various tools that we have, the concept, for example, ijma, which is consensus of the community, you find that in large fragments of Muslim society, the community, the Muslim majority, are basically out of the decision-making process, be it on the religious level or even on the political level. We are in a state of inertia. You look at other concepts, for example, like ibadah, which some would simply translate it as salah, your actual ibadah that you basically engage in. But when you look at it at a very fundamentally deeper level, you would find that ibadah doesn't just simply mean coming to the masajid and, for example, engaging in the 5 daily salah, or as some Muslims would do, just only coming to the masajid on Jummah. What happens, for example, when you leave your house or your workplace and then you're walking and taking the terrain to the masjid, and then you see yourselves in a society where there's rampant xenophobia, where there's a sense of deprivation, where there is a sense of need, where there is a lack of basic need, and we simply do nothing about it, where people are lacking both materially as well as spiritually, and we somehow believe that we have fulfilled our mandate when we go and engage in ibadah. Because part of the spiritual quest in Islam is to concern oneself with regards to the environment. Part of the spiritual quest is to deal with the issues that we see in our society on a daily basis. But unfortunately, it seems to me that as a community as a whole, not only do we lack to maintain this interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran, where it has a relevant meaning in our lives and in the lives of people around us, but also in terms of what is happening in our communities at large, there seems to be a total lack. Now, we look at one commandment. This takes me to the particular discussion today. If you look at Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 103. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, which can be paraphrased as, hold fast to the bond of unity which Allah created in the Ummah, and never divide yourselves into sects or groups on any grounds whatsoever. Now, if you look at the definition of Ummah, which some people would simply ascribe to as being the Muslim community, if you look at someone like the great scholar of the 20th century, Ismail Faruqi, he basically points out that Ummah is far more encompassing and not something which can be circumscribed. The Jewish community in Medina during the Medinan state were very much at the earlier stages part of the Muslim Ummah, because they were under the control of the Muslim leadership, of the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ at that particular point in time. And so if one were to translate it into a 21st century context, Ummah would also mean the disenfranchised in our communities around us, be they Muslim or non-Muslim for that particular matter. But these terms need to be viewed in a broader context. So it says here, hold fast to the bond of unity which Allah has created in the Ummah, and never divide yourselves into sects or groups on any grounds whatsoever. In Surah Adhab, chapter 30, verse 32, مِنَ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Those who divide themselves on petty grounds or into mutually hostile religious groups, and each and every single group regarding itself on the right path and the other group as absolutely contemptible, meaning on the path of kafir. And this is becoming increasingly problematic globally, because globally you find people now are adopting the position of takfir, where you can simply just excommunicate someone on the basis that they are different. Like the phenomenon that we have today in the Middle East, this group which we'll be discussing this afternoon or the latter part of this evening, ISIS, on the grounds that people who are viewed as outside the boundaries of Islam are there to be exterminated, eliminated, and totally got rid of. That is an antithesis to what you find in the Quran itself. In fact, contrary to the teachings of the Quran. And yet you see that this phenomenon is becoming more and more prevalent in our community, where people take on absolutist positions. You are right. You adopt the position of self-righteousness pertaining to your narrow interpretative worldview, and everybody else is wrong, or they're probably going to go to hell. So when you adopt that position, you go directly against this particular verse, where Allah says that this idea of division in the community is akin to shirk, in the previous verse, verse 31. And that is viewed as something which is unpardonable in Surah Nisa, verse 48. So this is increasingly becoming a problem in our communities where absolutist positions are taken. And this takes me back to the initial point. This only happens when we atomize or take particular verses out of context, where you simply do what we would call the cherry-picking fallacy. You'll quote, for example, Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 5, Surah 8, verse 60, Surah 47, verse 4, Surah 2, verse 190. All these particular verses, not in their context, but totally divorced out of the context. Slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Lie in wait for them. Besiege them. Totally divorced out of the historical context and the milieu in terms of which these particular verses have been revealed. And on that basis, adopt a position whereby someone who is different is effectively removed and eliminated from your worldview. And the deeper problem is this. When people adopt these particular positions, the external force, the empire, uses it as a means to create what we would call the classic rule and divide. If you look at a situation, we had a discussion earlier this morning. If you look at the Rwandan genocide that took place in 1994, Rwandan society comprised of the groups called the Tutsis and the Hutus, who eventually engaged in mass extermination of each other. Prior to the genocide in 1994, you had, even though there was traditional rivalry, the Tutsis and the Hutus were essentially a whole-knit community. They were a very united community, although they had their traditional rivalries, but they were viewed as a homogeneous African community. If you look at parts of the Muslim world today, this idea of excommunicating other people leads to greater division in the community, creates a series of disenfranchisement in the widespread mass, and this division is then exploited by imperial power, who uses it as a means and basis for creating more division and, of course, taking over things like basic wealth, the supplies, the infrastructure, the food supply of the particular country, the wealth of the country, and you find an entire community and countries that are totally dislocated. And far more easier to control and far more easier to take over in terms of where they view each other in relation to each other. So it's important to note then that the principle of unity is an established fact of Islam, and from these there are certain fundamental norms that are derived from these. One could be the principle of justice and selfless service to others flows from this idea of unity. Now, if you take into account something like justice, in Surah 4, verse 135, Ya alladhina amanu kunu qawamina bil qisti shuhada lillah. O believers, O people who have accepted Iman, stand by justice in each and every single dimension of life. Stand by it, not for the sake of expediency, meaning personal benefit, but purely for the sake of Allah. So when we do something in a general sense for the sake of Allah, then the ego, by extension, is completely annihilated. And then it goes on to say, وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَوِ الْوَالِدَيْنَ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ. Even if it may do damage against yourself personally, or against your parents, or against your next of kin. That's the absolute level and standard of justice that we are supposed to basically imbibe and internalize within ourselves. Otherwise, by simply offering one salah, which in itself is noble, but without doing justice to others, which flows from the principle of unity, that in itself would not lead to taqwa, because you would be seen as simply dispensing your duty, simply engaging in a ritual, without knowing or understanding the deeper implication. When the Quran says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ. What do you understand about the most rewarding virtue and the most difficult virtue? It could easily have suggested and said 5 daily salah. But it says here, فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. As has been translated here, raqaba, the abolishment or the elimination of all forms of servitude or slavery, or feeding in times of stress and famine and orphan. And then it goes on to say, and those who preach and teach and exemplify magnanimity and steadfastness, perseverance and human dignity, they will be on the righteous path. But Aqaba is described as the first virtue, abolishment of slavery from the world, abolishment of social injustice in society, and then subsequently to that, eventually your virtues in terms of your worship then flow from that. So here's the point of emphasis, which sometimes seems to be lost, is that extreme forms of religious piety, excessive forms of religiosity, meaning you could have the outer apparels, wearing the kurta, wearing a beard, the hat, doesn't necessarily mean that you will attain absolute spiritual fulfillment. There's a deeper level that you need to obtain, and this again flows from the Quranic concept of unity that you see epitomized throughout the Quranic text. And of course we see that in our communities, different categories of people who might need assistance and might need some sort of service require our particular assistance and our involvement. Where was the Muslim community, for example, 2 or 3 years ago when we had the tragedies in Marikana? Our voices should have been heard. We should have been foremost and prominent, because if we claim to have the solutions and if we believe that we stand on a higher moral ground, then surely our voices should have been heard. Our voices should have been heard lobbying government, challenging the oppressive status quo that you see enacted in our communities. But barring a few individuals here and there, the vast majority of Muslim community was not too involved in what had happened. Where were the marches for Marikana? Where were the marches for people who are being disenfranchised in our own communities? We don't see that. So there seems to be a selectivity sometimes, even in terms of some of the issues that we choose to deal with. Certainly there are global issues affecting the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim world at large. But there are also localized issues. And if we are not seen to be involved in expressing, at the very least, a certain degree of concern to what you see in our society at large, then how can we be seen to be the inheritors of that particular divine message? You see, it's our belief that the Quran is a revelation. It's not a book of, it's not a law. It's not a book of laws. It's not a Muslim holy book. But it viewed, or should be our belief, that it is a book of guidance for humanity. So if it is a book of guidance for humanity, then the message needs to be obviously reached out to the vast majority of humanity. And of course, the implications of the message, which should be internalized by us in terms of how we live out that message, the consequences should be manifest to our communities at large. And if that is so, then that should provide a legitimate alternative to the laws of our particular lands. But unfortunately, we don't see that happening. It's because of the fact that, by and large, a lot of us want to adopt the position of absolute self-righteousness to the extent where we want to excommunicate other people, and also at the same time we fail to see our particular world through the lenses of the Quran and the Sunnah. That is the absolute reference frame. That is constant. The ethics cannot change. But the ethics and the absolute reference frame allows you or provides you with the tools in order to utilize, to implement that message in society at large. And if it is not happening, then we need to do some degree of introspection in terms of seeing why it is not happening and what are our failings in our particular community. I'll give you one example of Muslim youth. I don't know if I've shared this before here in this particular masjid. If you look at the Maghazi literature, this is on a very simplistic level. During a battle between the Muslims and the external forces, several were seriously injured and wounded. And what had happened was that in this sanguinary warfare that ensued, when the water carrier was moving to tender for the injured people, you had a voice was heard from one quarter shouting out, stating, "I am thirsty, I am dying," a soldier. When the water carrier went to him, another voice was heard, a second voice. Another soldier screamed out, "I am dying, I'm thirsty, help me." The person who was in desperation there, who was in need of water, said, "Do not attend to me, attend to my brother there." When he went to the second soldier, another third voice was heard saying, "I am thirsty," or "I am dying," a call for help. The second soldier said that, "Do not attend to me, attend to my brother." That's a third soldier. And when the water carrier eventually went to the third soldier, all three died. Now, the principle from this, if it is part and recorded in our Islamic history, is that this is a level of selfless service that they had for their fellow human beings and for their fellow community. The level of unity that was existent at that particular time. And over a period of time, when disunity became part and parcel, when divide emerged, what happened? A classic example, during the time when Abdurrahman was the Umayyad Khalifa of Spain, they were expanding the empire into parts of Europe, and you find that the non-Muslim armies that they were facing constituted of the French and the Germans and neighboring territories. There was a battle that took place at Poitiers, which was in south of France, closer to Paris, the Battle of Poitiers. What happened was that they had victory, and then suddenly there was turmoil that emerged as a result of fight over booty, over wealth, and this created division. And when this division happened, the armies heard about this division, they planned an ambush, they sent the armies out, they destroyed and totally decimated the Muslim armies, and eventually the Muslims left Europe, and subsequently King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella expelled them from Spain. And eventually you had the decline. Another example, the Mughals, when they ruled India in 800, for 800 years, when you had certain provincial powers based on their own particular political whims, wanted to effectively be separate from the central government of Delhi, what eventually happened was that India became divided into different Muslim states, each basically running for power. And then what eventually happened? You had a small group of merchants. They call them the British East India Company. They came and totally decimated Muslim India. And eventually the colonial powers took over. So when you look at what takes place in the world today, we need to look at it not from the perspective of an us and them in polarized fashions. We need to sometimes take a step back and say, look, what is the agenda at play? Do we see precedents in our Islamic history? And do we see precedents of what is taking place in history in general? One of the fundamental core issues that I would leave today is that it's important that in developing unity within our community, we need to go back to maintaining what we would call, not go back to the Quran, but maintaining the interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran. When there is no connection, when people basically simply read the Quran for purposes of acquiring spiritual thawab, without understanding the basic meaning of the text, of what relevance and of what significance is it. If somebody were to give you a manual to operate a computer or a machine, and that manual were in Chinese, and you have a working knowledge in being able to read Chinese or Mandarin, but cannot understand a single word, of what relevance is that manual to you? And so that is a deeper question that we need to ask, not just simply to listen to what people say or speak from the pulpit, but individually, and of course collectively, take it upon ourselves to maintain this interpretive relationship with the text of the Quran, with our classic teachings, with certain concepts like ijma, shura, ijtihad, re-energize ourselves, reinvigorate ourselves with this classic Islamic ethos, and then of course move away from this impasse that we see on a daily basis around the world and in our communities at large. I've barely touched on the surface, but the issues that we face are challenging, and I don't profess to have any solutions here. But it's not for the solutions to be placed ready-made on a table. It's for us to utilize the framework that we have collectively as a community in developing meaningful solutions to the problems that we find in society at large. And so I'll end with the Quranic verse which says, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَاقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. That when truth in any form hurls itself against falsehood, then falsehood also in any form is bound to perish, for falsehood is by its nature bound to perish. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Happy Jummah Mubarak to all of you. Jazakallah to Advocate Yusuf, Ismail, for I think delivering a very, very important message and discussion. We all need to contemplate on that. The concept of unity in Islam is vital if you want to be part of this ummah. Unfortunately, we've become masters of disunity. And it stems from the leadership as well. Because many a time we follow like sheep. Allah has given us a brain. Use it. It's very, very important to realize what's happening in this world, in our communities, and in the Muslim countries. It's very, very important that we take cognizance of the fact. Don't rely on your CNNs and Al Jazeera's for news. Read, get that knowledge, listen to people like Yusuf and others. Arm yourself with knowledge. Knowledge is power. It's very, very important. And let this ummah be a loving ummah. I have a bit of time. It's a holiday. Let this ummah be a loving ummah. We are only seeing hate and condemnations and intolerance. That's all we're seeing in this world. Wherever you look, left, right or center. Yet, Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam epitomizes love. He even loved his enemies. We can't love our brothers. I mean, that says a lot for our condition. So, Jazakallah once again, Brother Yusuf, for sharing your thoughts with us. And if you want to hear Brother Yusuf discussing another topic, inshallah, he will be at the Artridgeville Masjid next door, our neighbors, after Maghrib Salah. And he will be discussing the problem of ISIS and the general situation prevalent in the Middle East. Should be a very, very interesting talk. In fact, they've had a mass Jumma and an anti-xenophobic rally this afternoon. So, in fact, if you have time after this, you can all proceed to Artridgeville. Otherwise, try and get there to the Artridgeville Masjid rather read your Maghrib Salah there, and we can participate in that talk once again.
تبسم تبسم وخل الهموم وخل الغموم وخل الضجر